Hi guys, hope you're doing well. This video is going to be titled probably "Peace and Safety," something of that nature. But basically, it's what I see going on right now. We seem to have stepped into that point in time in which there's a lot of talk of peace and safety, peace and security for Israel. That's important. Let me just set this, make sure that the focus is right on that. Sorry. So that's what we're talking about. So I thought it'd be great to kind of do a prophecy update in reference to that. Uh, so yeah, interesting things happening. So there was, when they're talking about this peace with Israel and UAE, and that other people, other nations are probably going to follow suit pretty soon. Well, number one, let me just say that that we as Christians we want peace. We want peace with Israel. Sometimes people who are associated with prophecy, it's almost like they look at people and they say, "Oh, you want war, you want this, you don't want peace." It's like, no, that's not true at all. We desperately want peace for Israel. But we know that lasting peace will not come until the Messiah comes. Why? It's not our words; it's God's words, and I'll reference that as we get into it as we talk about our key verses here. So the first one's obviously going to be 1 Thessalonians 5:1-3. So we'll go ahead and read that real quick, and then we'll jump into a couple other things, and then kind of get a reference to a video that came out of a meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu, Jared Kushner, and Robert O'Brien. They recently gave a talk in Jerusalem and how they're moving towards peace for Israel and other nations and the Arab nations, which we think are wonderful. I think this is wonderful that there's peace and that there should be, we should encourage peace. But what we're saying is you have to keep a realistic biblical worldview on things and realize that lasting peace will not happen until the Messiah comes, because there's forces, spiritual forces at work in these things, and the spiritual forces of darkness want the destruction of Jewish people, want the destruction of Israel, and it wants the destruction of people who will come to believe in Jesus Christ during the tribulation as well. Obviously, we're under protection of God, and when we go to be with Him, those who come to Christ during the tribulation will be hunted and killed without God. Supernatural protection that He gives to us right now, and the reference to that, I would say biblically, if you get a chance, you can look at my Revelation chapter 13 video, where it talks about how God won't intervene supernaturally, and that it will call for patience on the part of the saints. So anyway, let's get into what we're talking about. So he goes in chapter 5, verse 1-3 of 1 Thessalonians. Now, as to the times and to the epochs, brethren, you have no need for anyone to be written to you, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come to you like a thief in the night. I love that verse. Most people do. While they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like a labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. It's amazing. So many people, they've heard the gospel, they've had people talk about Jesus Christ, but they reject it. And suddenly what's going to happen is we're not going to be here. We're out of here. We're gone. And when he says, like, when labor pains come upon a woman, one minute she's waiting for the birth, the next second labor pains are upon her. I mean, that quick. I think, it's going to happen fast. And one of the things that it's talking about in the context of it, remember, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is talking about us going to be with the Lord. Those who die in Christ and so forth, and us who are alive will be transformed and be with the Lord, caught up in the air, caught up being where we get the terminology for rapture, in the transliteration of it, translation of it. So and we go to meet the Lord in air. That's how we get this ideal, this teaching, clear teaching of the rapture event itself. When people say it's not in the Bible, it is. It's there clearly. It's just a translation of it. So, but in the context of what he's talking about, the end is the end times, and when we start talking about that period of time, it's going to come rapidly and quickly, and I think it will be right after the rapture of the church. The rapture will take place, and then you're going to see this time, in which will be a horrible time to be alive on earth. So that's what I'm talking about. So it's not talking. People aren't talking about war right now in the Middle East. I mean, amazingly. I mean, people are always talking about war. There's always wars. War all the time. It always has been. But what they're talking about right now, which is very unique, is this concept of peace. Peace is what you hear what's taking place right now. You see a lot of that happening. We should encourage that. Obviously, we want peace, and we should be for that. But realize through a biblical lens, we need to understand that, for the Jewish people and for Israel, there's spiritual forces at work, and that, war is what's been decreed for its people until the end. So even though we should encourage peace, just like we have with Egypt, and people sometimes think we just want war so the end times can come and Jesus Christ can appear. No, we can't make Jesus come any faster. He's going to come when he comes. But we do wish for Jesus Christ to return, obviously. But we're simply acknowledging what's taking place in real life. Right? We have no way as Christians to change the trajectory of events happening in the world, and much less know how it's all going to play out. There's just too many dominoes, chess pieces, whatever you want to say, variables out there for us to even guess how it's all going to play out. And for somehow, the church is going to make this transition or changes in the world to make it happen. It's just so foolish. But as Christians, we obviously do believe in God's word. We believe it's supernatural. We believe that God has given us these prophecies for a reason, and he commands us to be looking and to be ready. Just like he warns all people. He says, when I said you got to say to all, be ready. We need to be looking. We need to be ready. Well, part of that is understanding the signs and the times of what's happening and events that are prophesied throughout the Bible all the way through. So we don't want to just make one verse or be all in all to prophecy, but we certainly want to look at it and say, clearly, when they start talking about peace and safety, sudden destruction is going to come upon them. He's talking about these end times. He clearly says the day of the Lord, which is a direct reference to, I think, the end times, the tribulation, and so forth, when the second coming of the Messiah will come. And prior to that, notice that the rapture is what is talked about and referenced in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So the rapture of the church, the day of the Lord, tribulation period, sudden destruction, so forth comes. But we also see in chapter 9 of Daniel, it's talking about this 70 weeks prophecy, the famous prophecy given to Daniel, which and he goes on to say that war and destruction is what's decreed until the very end. But we'll go ahead and just read through it real quick. It's verses 24 through 26, so it's not very long. So bear with me for just a second. Sometimes I read kind of choppy just because I'm thinking about the things I have to say, so I apologize in advance. Usually when I read is much more fluid, but when you're reading and speaking, sometimes you're thinking about what your thoughts, and sometimes you're reading, it sounds a little choppy, so I apologize in advance. That's why. So 70 weeks have been decreed for you, for your people and your holy city, which would be Jerusalem, obviously, to finish the transgressions, to make an end to sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So clearly, this is a pretty big prophecy. This is one that's going to encompass the entirety of the Jewish people, all the way from this point, the decree of the rebuilding of the temple, all the way till the return of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Obviously, they didn't understand the first coming of him, but if they actually pay attention, they would see that in verse 26, but they kind of missed that, But Jews even today, I've pointed it out to Jews, and at least I think they understood, but because they're so dogmatically opposed to Christianity because of events, they confuse what some who claim to be Christians, i.e. Catholics, that have killed Jews, that they somehow hate Christianity. They throw the baby out with the bathwater, not realizing that Christianity was founded by Jesus, who's God. Literally, could have picked any tribe in the world. He picked the Jewish people. He came with that tribe, and he established his truth and his witness to the Jewish people, which is what they are. As the Bible talks about, the book of Isaiah says that's what he called them to be, as witness to the world, to the nations. Well, it's a Jewish faith, and we've been grafted in as Gentiles. So all we're sharing with them is what is of their own heritage, but sometimes they reject it because I say, unfortunately, blinds them. He goes on to say, so you are now so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild the Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, right? It will be built again, the plaza and the moat in the times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city, which we know was Rome. So we know the Prince who is to come will be the Antichrist, and it will end, and its end will come with a flood, or quickly, just like Jesus, or just like it was talked about by the Apostle Paul. We just read in 1 Thessalonians that it's going to come rapidly and quickly. Well, this is what the prophet Daniel's being told as well by the angel Gabriel. Even to the end, and there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he goes on to talk about the Antichrist, obviously in verse 27. But that's the part we was wanting to look at. Was the key verse there would be the end of 26, which goes on to say that, and its end will come with a flood, just like we said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. So we realize that what's going to happen is wars. It's not going to be peace. And that when they're saying peace and security, or peace and safety, depending on how your translation puts it, actually what's going to happen is wars are going to happen. The big wars are going to happen. The end until we get to the Armageddon, obviously the big war, the final one, the finale of it all, persecution of believers in Christ, all that's going to happen. Persecution of the Jewish people is going to happen at this period of time that we call the tribulation. But it's going to come very quickly, very rapidly. But it's all going to happen at a time when they're talking about peace and security, peace and safety. Well, that's what we see happening right now. When all these other events that I've talked about in other videos is happening as well. The rebuilding of the temple, the artifacts being restored, the Sanhedrin being reestablished, the Gog-Magog alliance is forming all around Israel with Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and Libya. We see some other events that are at least in the early stages, the surrounding nations around them, which are eerily absent from the Gog-Magog war, are either at peace with Israel or they're having such issues that they wouldn't be of any factor in a war against Israel, and that's why they're absent. So when you look at all these things that clearly are happening, global worldwide technology, worldwide communications, visual worldwide communications, this is Revelation 11 talks about this. The darkness and coldness of people's hearts. You look around the world and see how that's happening. It's everywhere. People are just desperately wicked and hating each other for no reason. Minor things, and sets people off. Their love is wax cold. People be lovers of pleasure, lovers of godliness and everything else, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, denying Jesus Christ the true power, but having the form of their own godliness, their own righteousness. Say, I'm a good person. How many times you hear that from somebody as you see them doing something horrible? I'm a good person. Well, by whose standard? What standard of good are you using? I think when you look at what's happening and you look at what's going on, I think sorry, throat was getting a little dry there. When you see what's happening, what's going on, this peace and safety is the real thing. It's interesting, which tells you that the one who causes this, going back to Daniel chapter 9, which I've read many times, I'll read again, verse 27. And he, speaking of the prince who is to come, the Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, for 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice, grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will cause one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So divine judgment will come upon that Antichrist figure, this false prince who is to come, which we see happening, talked about in Revelation and other places, 2 Thessalonians and others. But the point being is that there's going to be a temple. It's going to be, a temple in which this Antichrist figure goes in, declares himself to be God, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But at the same time, he's going to set up this false idol, false image of himself with this false prophet, Revelation 13, and he's going to, obviously declare himself to be God and so forth. But we should be looking for a peace agreement that's stated to be 7 years. So a temporary peace agreement that's stated on 7 years. That's the key. So when he's talking about peace agreements with all these other nations, we don't need to freak out. We don't need to say, "Yeah, well, this is it." No, we need to enjoy peace, push for peace, want peace, pray for peace, but realize that keep an eye on those who are working those peace agreements. And I'm not saying that Jared Kushner is the Antichrist, but I'm saying if I had to pick somebody right now, he'd be at the top of the list. Number one, he's not a believer in Jesus Christ. Number two, he could fit the mold of somebody claiming to be the Messiah, God incarnate, the God man, just as Jesus Christ is truly the God man, the nature of God, of fully God, fully man. Well, this guy's going to claim the same thing. He's going to be the antithesis of Christ. He's going to be, claim to be God, but in fact, he's not. He's empowered by Satan. And anyways, we can see that this person is going to come on the scene, and for the Jews to accept him as their Messiah, he'd have to be Jewish. So some people don't believe the Antichrist will be Jewish, he'll be Gentile. I personally think he's more inclined to be Jewish because the Jewish people initially accept him. And the rebuilding of the temple and all this stuff. So to me, I think he will be Jewish. Who knows? At the end of the day, like I said, I've always said we need to hold these things a little lightly. My view on how the whole final configuration of this final 10 beast nation empire comes about, I actually think the United States is probably part of that. But yeah, it's the little horn, and so forth that comes up for a short period of time, comes up after the other ones. Well, the United States is a fairly young nation. It came up far after all the other ones. And I think it may have a part of all those other nations which it talks about. A lot of people used to always teach, like Al Lindsay and others people always teach. And I love those guys. Wonderful people, wonderful brothers in the Lord. But they used to always talk about, hey, we're just going to have the attributes of these kingdoms. Well, could be, maybe that's what it means. They'll have the attributes of these other ones, the Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. But maybe it means that when it talks about them, that those are all part of this final global configuration of this beast empire that will come up to the very last days is for only 10 minutes, for a short period of time, for 1 hour, for a very short period of time. They give their power and authority to the Antichrist, this one single ruler. You could see after this Magog war that takes place and certain aspects that will be damaged around the world, that there will be a call for global unity and global government like never before. And you could see where the preeminent powers that may be around would suddenly say, we need to be, we need to have a new order, a new empire, new global empire. And you can see where then suddenly the people will be open to these things. And that's where you could see where, with Brexit taking place, you could see where the British Commonwealth would be open to something like that, maybe like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, like the UK, like the United States. You got to remember that was at one time it was a colony of Britain. And then you would maybe see, remember, Persia's its army and everything is destroyed in the Gog-Magog war, but its people, part of that empire may want to be a part of that coalition. Just like, remember, Japan was, an enemy of the United States in World War II. Germany was an enemy of, now they're allies. And the same thing could happen in this situation, in this war. You could see where Persia could be a part of this final empire. You can see where Iraq or Babylon becomes a part of this final empire. Greece, Italy, who knows, maybe Spain, maybe another one, maybe some other, all together be 10 nations from all over that will make up this global power that will permeate and have the aspects of the Roman Empire. Just like the two legs split, Constantinople and Rome, and then the 10 toes, it's like a split again. It kind of goes out, It doesn't have to be the geographical, I don't believe it has to be the geographical location of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire. It's different. It looks different. It acts differently. It's more, crushing of all people and all nations and so forth. So try to adhere to one another, but doesn't. I mean, it could be the a form of the European Union. It could be a 10-nation one, kind of like people are alluding to with Macron and those kind of people who are kind of trying to form a 10-nation coalition of Europe. Very well could be that in times one. I mean, if the United States is destroyed, or if other nations are really damaged and destroyed, you can see where Europe might emerge as the one that people would look to for leadership in the world. That could be the case. Yeah, I can see that happening. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing that if that's what we want to see. But if it's global and it's global in power and it's, and so forth, you really can see the United States somehow playing a role in that empire, where a leader could come out of that small nation, or nation that comes up at the end, and knocks three off, and so forth. Well, if you look at the United States, it kind of has. It was the one who really defeated Italy. It was in World War II. It was the one who defeated Iraq. It's the one who, what's the other one that defeated Babylon? It was what it be, or you start thinking about some of these. It would be the one who would defeat Persia, if you really look at it in the sense of the God-Magog war. If it's the sword that's talked about, where God brings a sword against this army, most likely that would be the United States. It's the one who really has the only sword big enough like that army power to take on such a coalition and defeat it. You would clearly see the United States most likely be that one. So you would see that as part of that, those ones who would be defeated, where it talks about this. I mean, you can kind of see those things. You see Spain. The United States beat Spain in the Spanish-American War. That could be one of the three. You could see, when you start thinking about these kind of things, well, the United States really does fit in a lot of ways, besides having an immense army and power and so forth, and its drift away from God and into humanism and so forth that we've seen kind of fits that mold as well. And the rapture would just accelerate that, because Christians would be gone. So you could clearly see that a drift towards all-out humanism in the United States, pushing everything that you can possibly think of, sexual perversion, everything else around the world, godlessness through Hollywood and everything else. Yeah, you can clearly see how the United States might fit that mold. So anyway, I did want to play a little bit of that video just so you can kind of hear it. I hope you could hear this. I'll turn it all the way up. So I apologize. I should probably get a microphone at some point here, and so people can hear me a little bit better. Some people say, hey, you need to speak up. I naturally talk softly. It's just, that's just me. It's just how I talk. But so I probably need to get some of that stuff, but anyway, it is what it is. I'm not a professional at this stuff, so I'm not a tech guy by any means. So maybe I need to have somebody who's a tech friend or something that can do some of the stuff for me. So anyway, we'll go and play this a little bit. Hopefully you can hear this.
And thank you, Prime Minister, for your hospitality today and for your warm words. Today, obviously, we celebrate a historic breakthrough for peace, and it has been a long and a winding road to get here. A day that we really should take a moment to celebrate, because this is an accomplishment that does not happen often, did not happen easy, and is really thanks to a lot of great work that was done by a lot of people over the last years. You mentioned the detractors, and they were detracting not because they didn't have good odds to be detracting with, and not because
very
it wasn't
intelligent.
an impossible task, but that was what the
either he's just really amazing guy,
and we worked
or he's supernaturally empowered in some way, because the stuff he's accomplished is amazing.
One of the reasons why they thought it was so impossible is that if you go back 3.5 years when Donald Trump became president of the United States, Israel and the broader Middle East had very serious problems. Iran and its proxy militias, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the different groups, militias they were funding in Syria and Iraq, and also the Houthis in Yemen, were basically flush with cash after $150 billion in sanctions relief was granted, and $1.5 billion in cash was delivered to them. They were also on a glide path to a nuclear weapon, which would have meant permanent instability in this region and perhaps in the entire world. Syria and Iraq were totally destabilized, and ISIS had a caliphate the size of Ohio. Christians were being killed, ethnic cleansing was occurring, and American journalists were being beheaded. Israel's relationship with America was at its lowest point in decades, and the United Nations had just passed a disastrous resolution which put Israel at great risk. When President Trump came into office, everything started to change very quickly. The first thing President Trump did was appoint our Ambassador David Friedman, who will go down as the greatest American ambassador to Israel in history. And he has worked very, very hard to work with President Trump and our team to strengthen the bond between America and Israel. President Trump immediately stood up for Israel at the United Nations against the rampant anti-Semitism by injecting common sense and pragmatism into the debate.
He just speaks
and
very
really
elegant,
pushing things forward.
But he's the one that's really
President
the
Trump
one that's
exited
always
the Iran
talking
deal,
at these peace
restored
things. And
America's
he's always
sanctions
the one
to
initiating.
Iran,
He's always the
greatly
one
weakening
going
the
around. And he kind
regional
of talks about that
adventurism
here in just a second.
to make Israel and America's Arab partners in the region more secure. And then just 2 weeks ago, Secretary Pompeo announced the snapback of all United Nations sanctions against Iran. President Trump defeated the territorial caliphate of ISIS and eliminated its leader, al-Baghdadi. And then against a lot of objections throughout the world, President Trump kept his promise, and he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and quickly moved his embassy here to Jerusalem, where we'll be visiting at some point today.
So he's high on my list of
President Trump then recognized the Golan
Not saying he
Heights
is
and
Antichrist, but definitely somebody we want to keep an eye
That also
on.
was another step towards
Definitely a smart guy.
security.
I mean, if he's not, he's
And then on January
pretty
28th
amazing
of this
fellow.
year, we released
no
President
doubt
Trump's
about
vision
it.
for
I'm
peace,
very impressed with
which
him.
is a pragmatic
If I
and
wasn't concerned
realistic
about him being
blueprint for
Antichrist,
how we can
I would
have
be
actual
like
peace
really
in
high
this
on him being
region.
the
It's
guy
based
who's
on the
the
facts as they
next
exist.
president of the United States.
And it shows
He
that
may wanna be.
the United States
Never know what's gonna
understands
happen.
Israel's security needs, but what this vision showed the world was that Israel was ready to make peace. And the offer that's been made to the Palestinians is a very gracious, realistic offer. And when they are ready to make peace, they now have the opportunity to do so. And that offer showed other people in the region that Israel was serious, and that led to the breakthrough we've had here today. When President Trump announced the deal, it shouldn't be lost on people that ambassadors from the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Bahrain attended the ceremony at the White House, perhaps foreshadowing what we've been able to accomplish here. And then finally, on August 13th, not finally, just the last, there'll be a lot more to come. On August 13th, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed announced a historic peace agreement that will create previously unthinkable economic and security, religious opportunities between.
See, when he's talking about peace and security, did you notice that? Economic and peace and security. That's what they've been talking about a lot. Kind of falls right into what we was talking about. So I stop it right there. You know, very interesting stuff. You know, and this is the guy who's really the guy that's been tasked with to go around and do this, to initiate these peace agreements and to get people the unthinkable to become thinkable, to actually happen. And he's done it. I mean, this guy is an amazing guy. I mean, he's the guy that really headed up the USMCA Act, you know, the Canadian-Mexican United States economic replacement to NAFTA. He's the guy that headed up the prison reform. He's the guy that headed up a lot of the UN stuff that was going on with Israel. He's the one that headed up the movement of embassy to Jerusalem, an acknowledgement of Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, which was, I believe, a direct reference to the half part of, the Joel chapter 3 prophecy, where it talks about, if you get a chance, you can read that. I've gone over that a number of times, but I think it's one we need to keep an eye on. So I definitely want to reference back to that often. But Joel chapter 3 verses 1 and 2 talks about when we see the restoration of Jerusalem and Judea. You know, what it's talked about is the sovereignty of Jerusalem over that those places. Well, yeah, and they're dividing his land. Specifically, what we see happening, the division of the land while they have sovereignty over those areas, which Netanyahu talks about in this speech, that they would have sovereignty and authority over these areas, but it would be a divided land given to the Palestinians and Israel would have control over Judea and Samaria, the Jezreel Valley, and so forth. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you start thinking about this. I mean, it's right out of the book of Joel. You know what I mean? It's like you took Joel chapter 3 and took those two verses and pulled it out. It's exactly what we see happening. And the person who's the key guy talking about it is Jared Kushner. So we need to keep an eye on him, not in a bad way, not, we pray for their safety and all this stuff, but we do need to keep an eye on it because there's a guy who's basically initiating these peace agreements, and how this all plays out. Remember, the Gog-Magog war, when it does happen, will change a lot of the things around the world, I think, and including how national coalitions and so forth. So anyway, hopefully this is a blessing to you. Just thought it's something worth putting out there. So God bless, be safe, and pray for the peace in Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Israel, pray for the peace of America and the world, and and be at peace with those you can, as much as possible. God bless, be safe, and I'll see you in the stuff. I'll see you in the kingdom come.